Okay, so let's get started. We're going to be taking a look at how to set up and work with basic nitrous control in our M1 programming. Now this is going to be using the GPRP or the GPR package. Other firmware packages may differ in terms of what they offer for programming within the nitrous control. But what we'll find here is the general overview of how to deal with a basic nitrous on-off control will be applicable pretty much any firmware package you may be running into. Let's jump in here and take a look at what we need to know about nitrous first, and then we'll talk about how to configure, set up, and program our nitrous control. Now, what we have coming up on screen is going to be some illustrations just talking about the differences between what types of nitrous we might be working with. So the first thing we need to know is that there's going to be either a dry or a wet style nitrous you may be controlling. When we're talking about the dry style nitrous, that's going to be providing the additional fuel flow that we need to provide to the engine when the nitrous is spraying. So dry is just spraying nitrous only. When we're talking about a wet nitrous kit or wet nitrous shot, that's going to be spraying both the nitrous and the fuel through separate jets. So we have nitrous spraying through a jet and additional fuel flow spraying through another jet. So in addition to this, we're going to have a couple different ways that we can implement our nitrous, whether it's wet or dry. So we'll find that we have a single dry fogger or a single wet fogger, doesn't really matter. That's where we have a jet in our intake tube. This would be applicable for pretty much any 50 to maybe a 75 shot of nitrous. Anything higher than that, we can run into distribution problems of the nitrous and the fuel if you have a wet shot, or just the nitrous with the dry shot. Working its way into the engine, we have to rely on an equally balanced intake manifold distribution for our airflow to make sure that the nitrous is going to get into each cylinder equally. We'll find that most intake manifolds will have some type of flow imbalance, and that's going to lead to issues supplying the correct fueling to the engine when we have nitrous spraying. The ideal way to control nitrous is going to be a direct port. We may be doing direct port where we have a nitrous nozzle jet per intake runner. We can find that either in the wet or the dry format. And then we do have another option here. We see plate spray bar. This is for carburetor retrofits. This really isn't going to be applicable for an M1. But what we're taking away from here, we know what a dry and a wet shot are going to be. And then we also understand the difference between a fogger or a direct port kit. So the direct port is what we're going to cover and talk about in this training module. And we're going to talk about how to set up and work with a dry direct port. So we're going to be adding the additional fuel flow through the fuel injectors when we're going in and setting everything up. But I will talk about how to deal with a dry shot of nitrous as well. A lot less programming there, a little bit more simplistic for control. So let's jump in and take a look at how we need to configure and set up our nitrous control. So this is going to require us to have an on-off toggle switch for an arming switch. We have to have a nitrous bottle. We have to have a nitrous solenoid. We'll have, if we have a 4-cylinder engine, in my case, I'll have one nitrous jet per intake runner. We'll have a relay, 30-40 amp relay, basic relay, or you could have a solid state relay, doesn't really matter. An on-off, basic on-off 30-40 amp relay will be sufficient. And then finally, we find that we have our Motec box that's going to be controlling things. Now, the way that we set this up is going to be very specific in terms of controlling our relay to turn on the nitrous solenoid. Now, nitrous solenoids will vary in terms of the amp draw on the solenoid. They will be a continuous style solenoid, so we need to make sure that we have our relay between our nitrous solenoid, because generally speaking, they usually pull about 12. I've seen as much as 20 amps when the nitrous solenoid's on. So we don't want to go and damage the Motec, so I usually always wire a relay between the Motec and the nitrous solenoid. So assuming that we're running a low side output for ignition or fuel injector to control the actual relay, the relay absolutely needs to be there, because we only have about a 3 amp sinking capability with the Motec, meaning we can only actually provide 3 amps to the device we're controlling. And the nitrous solenoid is going to pull more than that. Now we do have our half bridge outputs. So depending if we're controlling in the low or the high side, they can support different amounts of amperage. And in the case of a nitrous solenoid, because they can vary pretty widely, I would recommend to always put a relay between the Motec and the nitrous solenoid, even if you're using a half bridge output, even though they do have more sinking capability with that half bridge output. All right, so let's look at our schematic here real quick, and we'll talk about how we would wire things up here. So the very first thing, in order to activate our nitrous, so we need to add a nitrous switch. We can find that pictured right here. Now what we're going to find is the nitrous switch is going to have just a basic on-off toggle switch. It's going to have two legs. One leg of the switch will go to our chassis ground. It could be battery ground. It just has to touch ground. The other leg of the switch, so when we enable and toggle the switch, that will go ahead and ground the pin that we're designating for a nitrous switch on the Motec. So very simple the way we set this up, but we need to make sure that switch, well, I could set it 12 volt, but I usually set it ground. We need to make sure we're configuring that switch properly. We'll talk about how to do that here in this training module. Now moving on to the relay. We'll find on the relay, we're going to have a couple different pins, and we talked about how to set up and wire relays for output control. We're going to find on this basic on-off toggle relay, we're going to have pin 30, that's our power supply to the relay. That's going to our battery power or some type of power junction in your vehicle. It could be to the PDM, it could be to something that's supplying power. We'll also find then the pin 87, that's our output from a relay.
Thanks for checking out our teaser clip. If you want to see the rest of this video and more than 500 hours of current EFI training we have to offer, make sure you click right here. If you want to go and check out more teaser clips from this training course, click here, and you don't want to miss any of the videos we're going to be releasing on this channel, so make sure you subscribe and click here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.